Hi, I'm Anna Carson, from kinesiologist from Damara Wellbeing Kinesiology. And today I thought I would just tell you a little bit about my story, how I've got to being a kinesiologist, because I used to be an occupational therapist. So before I emigrated to Australia, which was over 6 years ago now, I worked in the NHS as an occupational therapist. And I worked in a number of different areas, including mental health, aged care, and then the place that I spent most of my time was in neurorehabilitation. So I worked in a hospital with clients or patients who had yes, some have had sort of traffic accidents, so had traumatic brain injuries. Other people I worked with multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's or other neurological conditions. And so, yes, so my fascination with the brain and the physical body and all that kind of really started then. And I loved that work and really trying to piece together, what was going on, where the damage had happened in the brain, what was happening and how that was impacting on the physical body, and then ways that we could really help to overcome that or to regain strength or movement or and really help empower people in their life. So that was then. Now, one of the frustrating things about the work was that we didn't look deeply into the psychology. So obviously, there was a lot of trauma for people who had injuries, so traffic accidents and work accidents, those sorts of things, but also so much grief and everything else when people had neurological things. And often we were finding that people just weren't in a space ready to change, or they couldn't change because of the psychological stuff, the things that was going on in their head, from an emotional point of view. And so, we'd be trying to work with people, but they just weren't in that space to be able to really make that change. So when I discovered kinesiology when we moved to Australia, I suddenly saw what was possible. Now, I had had kinesiology myself. I'd had, and some of you might have heard this if you'd listened to any of my other interviews. I've explained this story before, but I'll go into it again in a little bit. So I'd had kinesiology. I've been using kinesiology as a tool for helping me overcome the traumatic birth of my first child, my daughter, when I was paying for the birth of my second son, and I was finding your amazing kind of results and stuff like that. But it wasn't until after my son was born and he ended up with a urinary tract infection when he was only 6 weeks old. We went to the hospital because he had a very high fever. He was put on antibiotics. He had some tests done. But after his infection had cleared, when we went to see the specialist, he wanted to put him on long-term antibiotics and do lots of really invasive tests. Now, for a 6-week-old, I wasn't happy with that. And so I took him to the kinesiologist. And what she did was through her muscle testing, she worked out that what had happened was he'd had a stress response. So he'd actually fallen off the sofa a week prior, and he hadn't been injured, but he'd had a shock. And so the way that his body had dealt with that shock was to inflame his urethra. Now, that then caused the urinary tract infection. Now, she cleared that shock from his body and that response. And he's never had a UTI since. He's never had an infection since. He's never had any issues. And I suddenly realized at that point, I had really changed his life. Or the session had changed his life, because if we weren't to clear that, every time he got stressed, and we all have stress responses, so some of us, it can be digestive, or it can be, psoriasis or eczema, or, there's all sorts of ways that our bodies will respond under stress. And this was his particular one that he'd inherited through his father's line. Now, I realized that if we hadn't have cleared that through the kinesiology, then what would happen is that every time he went into a stressful situation or had stress, his stress response would be to inflame his urethra. He would get a urinary tract infection. And this would mean, obviously there would be nothing physical showing because this was a stress response. So he would be constantly on antibiotics, having tests, all this sort of stuff. And I was just like, my goodness, we've just changed that trajectory. That his trajectory of, of all of this intervention, we've changed that just by doing this one session. And that blew my mind. And so I came home and I said to my husband, okay, so we're going to need to spend a fortune on going to kinesiologists all the time to understand what's going on, or I need to study it. So I studied it. And so this is how I became a kinesiologist. And yeah, for me, the amazing thing of this is really about being able to get to the root cause of stuff, being able to understand what it is that we're struggling with, that are being shown generally. For me, my passion is understanding the physical body, and allowing this physical body to be the vessel for all that we are to be, our true, beautiful selves, our essence. And we need our physical body to be able to allow to do that because we're human, we're having a human experience. And so for me to be able to understand the messages that our body is sending us through the symptoms, and get to the cause of it, rather than just dealing with the symptoms, like a lot of doctors and even a lot of alternative health practitioners really look at the symptoms rather than going back to the cause. And for me, this was just the light bulb moment that I needed to go, okay, this is what I want, because I want to be able to make lasting change. I want to be able to empower people to really, move into that space of the potential that they feel. And so this is how I've ended up here. So yeah, I hope that really just gives you a little bit of understanding of kind of how I've got to this point. I've always been kind of in that sort of helping your kind of profession. Even when I was traveling a lot in my 20s, and I was one of my favorite jobs was helping sea turtles who were injured. So there's definitely, I'm doing a lot of brain stuff there too. So it's obviously there's obviously a little bit of a line that is traveling through my life, but here I am. And yeah, I hope that just gives you, like I said, a bit of understanding of how I've got here, my training from the occupational therapy side, plus then the kinesiology, which I've really kind of brought together to help us understand, how we can be the best version of ourselves, including from a physical point of view, as well as an emotional, mental, energetic and spiritual point of view too. All right, I'd love to hear any comments or anything like that, so do put them below or send me a message, and I look forward to connecting with you soon. All right, thank you.